There aren't fewer Catholics in the United States. Catholics are still the largest single religious group in the country. About 20 to 25% of the population identifies as Catholic. Growth has slowed down, and in some areas, numbers are even falling. Still, immigration from Latin America has fueled growth in the South and West, balancing out the decline in other places. Many individuals leave the faith because they disagree with church teachings on things like birth control and social issues. The Catholic Church in the U.S. began in the colonial era. By the mid-1800s, the Spanish, French, and Mexican presence had faded in importance. Protestant Americans had moved west, taking over many areas that were once Catholic. Small Catholic communities remained in Maryland, Alabama, Florida, and Louisiana, but not many beyond that. After 1840, Catholicism in America began to grow again, this time through immigration. Germans and Irish came in large numbers. After 1890, Catholics from Southern and Eastern Europe arrived, such as Italians and Poles. The church created a detailed structure. Local parishes were organized into dioceses, each run by bishops appointed by the Pope. Every diocese built schools, colleges, hospitals, orphanages, and other institutions for charity and education. The history of Catholicism before 1776 usually focuses on the 13 English colonies along the Atlantic coast. These were the colonies that broke away from Britain to form the United States. But the story also includes French and Spanish colonies, which later became part of the country. Catholic life was strong in Florida, Texas, California, Puerto Rico, and much of the Southwest. Most Catholics in America during the colonial era came from England, Germany, and France. By 1775, around 10,000 Irish Catholics had also arrived. Most of them settled in Maryland and Pennsylvania. In 1700, Maryland had about 29,600 people, and around 1/10 of them, roughly 3,000, were Catholic. By 1756, that number had grown to about 7,000, and by 1765, it reached 20,000. In Pennsylvania, there were about 3,000 Catholics in 1756 and 6,000 by 1765. By the end of the Revolutionary War in 1783, there were about 24,000 to 25,000 Catholics in all of the United States, out of a total population of about 3 million. Catholicism first came to what is now the United States through Spanish colonists. They brought the faith to the Virgin Islands in 1493, Puerto Rico in 1508, Florida in 1513, South Carolina in 1566, Georgia between 1568 and 1684, and across the Southwest. The first known Catholic Mass in the future United States took place in 1526. Dominican friars Antonio de Montesinos and Anthony de Cervantes held the Mass for the San Miguel de Guadalupe colonists. The colony only lasted 3 months. Catholicism also entered the English colonies with the founding of Maryland. Maryland was one of the few English colonies where Catholics made up a significant group. But after the Royalists lost in the English Civil War of 1646, new laws cracked down on Catholics. These laws banned Catholic education and expelled Jesuits from Maryland, including Father Andrew White. Their school at Calverton Manor was destroyed. Immigration later turned the colony into a majority Protestant population. Still, Jesuits secretly kept Catholic schools running. Maryland stood out because it offered some religious toleration, unlike most other English colonies that pushed a militant Protestant faith. The Maryland Toleration Act of 1649 was one of the first laws to recognize tolerance for different forms of Christianity. It is often seen as a forerunner to the First Amendment. The first Protestant colonists who came to America carried a long history of hostility toward Catholics. That hostility went back to the Protestant Reformation. Both Catholics and Protestants had suffered in Europe during the religious wars that followed. Many were imprisoned, tortured, and killed. British Protestants especially remembered the reign of Queen Mary I, often called Bloody Mary. She ruled from 1516 to 1558 and burned hundreds of Protestants at the stake. That memory lingered when Protestants settled in the New World. Most of the original 13 colonies passed laws that restricted Catholics. Even Maryland, which was meant to be a Catholic refuge, turned against them. Protestants became the majority, and when they gained political control, they banned Catholics from voting, from holding public office, and from worshiping in public. During the American Revolution, things began to change. In 1776, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Maryland all passed acts of religious toleration. George Washington, both as commander of the army and later as president, promoted tolerance for all faiths. Catholics won more acceptance because many supported the patriot cause. Charles Carroll, a wealthy Catholic landowner from Maryland, even signed the Declaration of Independence. Catholics in revolutionary America were usually wealthy, English-speaking, and practiced their religion in private rather than in public. For that reason, Protestants mostly tolerated them. But the situation shifted in the 19th century. New Catholic immigrants began arriving in large numbers from Ireland, Germany, Italy, Poland, Mexico, and Lithuania. This wave of immigration made many Americans nervous about Catholic influence in the Republic. In 1789, the Catholic population in the U.S. was only around 30,000. By 1826, 250,000 more Catholics had arrived. By 1850, the total had passed 1 million. Most of these newcomers were poor and uneducated. German Catholics often farmed in the Midwest, but many others clustered in northeastern cities, living in crowded tenements and working in low-paying jobs. They were often portrayed as infidels and drunks, blamed for rising crime. Irish Catholics faced the worst prejudice. Centuries of British hostility toward the Irish shaped American views. Political cartoons often drew the Irish as dark-skinned, savage, and racially inferior. Irish immigrants, however, were more outspoken about defending their faith. Inspired by the Catholic revival in Europe, they organized large parish missions in cities, promoted reports of Marian apparitions, and openly claimed that sacramentals like medals, statues, pictures, and holy water carried divine grace. They also believed in miraculous healings, which many Protestants dismissed as superstition. The Catholic population rose quickly. In 1790, there were about 35,000 Catholics in the U.S. By 1820, that number grew to 195,000. By 1850, it had reached about 1.6 million, making Catholics the largest religious denomination in the country. Between 1860 and 1890, the Catholic population tripled again, thanks to both immigration and high birth rates. By the end of the 19th century, there were about 12 million Catholics in America. As the Catholic population in America grew in the 19th century, hostility grew with it. One of the most popular books before the Civil War attacked the Catholic Church directly. It was called The Awful Disclosures of Maria Monk, published in 1836. Only the Bible and Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin sold more copies. Maria Monk claimed she had been a nun in Canada. She said the Mother Superior forced her into sexual slavery, supposedly under orders from the Pope. Her story included shocking details: nuns beaten and locked in dungeons, priests sneaking through tunnels for secret affairs, and newborn babies strangled and thrown into lime pits in the convent basement. Reporters later exposed the book as fiction. Protestant ministers had actually written it, and they even went to court, fighting over the profits. But the book spread widely because it confirmed what many Protestants already suspected about Catholics. Monk also claimed she was never allowed to read the Bible or trust her own conscience. She said she had no judgment of my own and had to obey priests in everything, even tolerating rape and murder. For readers, this seemed like proof that Catholicism threatened American democracy. If Catholics obeyed the Pope above all else, how could they be loyal citizens of the Republic? In the early 1850s, a political movement rose out of this fear. Nativists formed the American Party, better known as the Know Nothing Party. They pushed for delays in citizenship and tried to block immigrants from voting. In 1854, they won major gains. 5 senators and 43 representatives were elected under their banner. Their momentum only ended when the Civil War began. In the 1830s and 1840s, well-known Protestant leaders like Lyman Beecher and Horace Bushnell attacked the Catholic Church. They didn't just call it theologically wrong. They also said it was an enemy of the nation's Republican values. Historians believe their fiery language helped fuel anti-Irish and anti-Catholic attitudes. Beecher's famous book, Plea for the West, came out in 1835. In it, he urged Protestants to keep Catholics out of Western settlements. At the same time, the Catholic Church's silence on slavery made many Northern Protestants angry. This hostility sometimes turned violent. On August 11, 1834, a mob burned down an Ursuline convent in Charlestown, Massachusetts. The violence showed how nativism, or hostility to immigrants, was becoming more than an attitude. By the 1840s, the Nativist movement had grown strong. It stirred up mob violence, the destruction of Catholic property, and even the killing of Catholics. Protestants claimed that Catholic immigrants were destroying American culture. Irish Catholics were especially blamed for spreading drunkenness and violence. In the 1850s, the movement gained political strength. The Know Nothing Party became its voice. In 1856, it even ran former President Millard Fillmore as its candidate for president. He lost, and the party collapsed, but the fears remained. Anti-Catholic movements kept appearing after that. In the 1890s, a group called the American Protective Association rose up. It started in 1887 in Clinton, Iowa, after the city's mayor, Arnold Wallaker, lost an election. Local Catholics and organized labor were blamed for his defeat. The association denounced politicians as being controlled by Catholics. Its leaders claimed credit for Republican victories during that period. In this way, anti-Catholic nativism kept shaping American politics into the late 19th century. If the Vatican had used a softer tone in the 19th century, Americans might have been less fearful of Catholics. But as revolutions in Europe cut the Church's political power, Pope Pius IX responded by strengthening its spiritual authority instead. In 1854, just 6 years after the Papal States lost their government, Pius IX declared the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. This teaching said the Virgin Mary had been conceived without sin. Then in 1864, he issued the Syllabus of Errors. It condemned liberal ideas about individual freedom and the free exercise of religion. The Pope argued it was an error to believe that every person was free to choose the religion that seemed true to them. Inside the Church, some Americanists supported the separation of church and state. They were rebuked for their views. Soon after, Pius IX called the First Vatican Council, which met from 1869 to 1870. That council declared that the Pope was infallible when officially defining dogma. Protestants grew alarmed at the growing Catholic population. They hoped the public school system would shape Catholic children into good Americans. But to them, American meant Protestant. In many schools, Catholic children were required to read from the King James Bible instead of their own Douay-Rheims version, which was based on the Latin Vulgate. Textbooks often included anti-Catholic stories as well. Catholic leaders told parents not to send their children to these schools. In 1884, the Third Plenary Council of Baltimore went further. It urged every parish to build its own school. Catholics argued that since they paid taxes, they should be able to direct some of that money to their own schools. The issue sparked heated debates that continue in some form even today. By building schools, orphanages, and hospitals, Catholics aimed to create their own distinct worldview. The Church distrusted liberalism and individualism. It taught that personal freedom must always remain subject to God's commandments. The Catholic Encyclopedia of 1910 explained this stance. It said liberalism was dangerous because it rejected divine authority. It pushed religion into private life and ignored Christianity and the Church as public and social institutions. Catholics also criticized free market capitalism. They argued it put profit above the common good. Employers, they said, had a moral duty to pay wages high enough to support not just the worker, but the worker's whole family. By the start of the 20th century, about 1/6 of the U.S. population was Catholic. By the century's end, Catholics made up about 24% of the population. Still, many Protestants saw Catholics as un-American. The Ku Klux Klan, which reorganized in 1915, took up this message. By 1924, the Klan had grown to about 2 million members. It targeted Catholics and Jews along with African Americans, calling them enemies of the nation. In 1928, when Democrat Al Smith became the first Catholic presidential candidate, the Klan spread warnings. They claimed the Antichrist had won. Rumors even spread that if Smith were elected, the Pope would move into the White House. Herbert Hoover defeated him easily. In 1949, Paul Blanchard published American Freedom and Catholic Power. The book sold more than 100,000 copies. It accused the Catholic hierarchy of plotting to force its policies on American schools, hospitals, government, and families. But by then, Blanchard's fears were already outdated. In the 1950s, more Catholics were attending college and joining the middle class. They seemed less like outsiders and more like part of the mainstream. As the Cold War began, Catholics took a strong anti-communist stand. Archbishop Fulton Sheen even hosted a popular television show called Life is Worth Living. It combined spiritual lessons with warnings about the Soviet threat. At its peak, the show had about 10 million viewers each week. The turning point came in 1960 when John F. Kennedy was elected president. He became the first Catholic to hold the office. Some Catholics disliked his promise that his faith would not affect his decisions as president, but most celebrated his victory. They saw proof that Catholicism and democracy could go hand in hand. Watching Kennedy swear to protect the Constitution was a source of great pride. Today, about 20% of adults in the United States call themselves Catholic. That share has stayed mostly steady since 2014. It is a little lower than in 2007, when 24% of adults identified as Catholic. In 2024, the U.S. Census Bureau estimated there were about 267 million adults in the country. That means there are roughly 53 million Catholic adults nationwide. The racial makeup of American Catholics is shifting. Right now, 54% are white, 36% are Hispanic, 4% are Asian, and 2% are Black. Another 2% identify with a different race. Since 2007, the share of white Catholics has dropped by 10 points, while the Hispanic share has grown by 7. Catholics in the U.S. also tend to be older than the general population. About 58% of Catholic adults are age 50 or older. For comparison, across all U.S. adults, that number is 47%, according to the 2023-24 Religious Landscape Study.